The fourth theme that will appear as a section in each chapter is nature culture. Geographers often work at the intersection of the natural sciences and the social sciences, looking at interactions between human systems and ecosystems. Geographers view the relationship between humans and the earth as a two-way relationship. Humans influence the environment, and the environment influences us in both positive and negative ways. We're going to look at 4 schools of thought that have framed academic discussion of human-environment interactions. They are environmental determinism, possibilism, environmental perception, and humans as modifiers of the earth. Environmental determinism was influential in the 1910s and into the 1920s. It has since fallen out of favor. This way of thinking posits that environmental characteristics, such as climate and soil type, determine human accomplishments and the type of civilization that arises. According to Ellsworth Huntington, the ideal environment was temperate, free from extremes of heat or cold, yet blessed with a seasonal contrast between winter and summer. Rainfall should be spread throughout the year, as prolonged dry seasons sap human health and mental acuity. Huntington translated these favorable conditions into numbers and then mapped them across the world. As seen in the top map, he concluded that climatic energy peaked in Western Europe and northeastern North America. New Haven, Connecticut, where he made his home, was in the ideal range, making Huntington a lucky man indeed. Huntington sent surveys to other scholars, asking them to rank a number of cultures. The bottom map shows these rankings. Once again, Western Europe and areas in the United States were given the highest rankings. It's clear that the selective bias and subjective bias of these academics greatly influenced the results. This kind of thinking was also racially biased and has its origins in much of the thinking that justified colonial rule. A step away from this overly deterministic thinking gives us possibilism. The physical environment is important as offering a set of particular resources, circumstances, and limitations, but a group's culture is determined by social conditions. Culture plays a role in how a group utilizes environmental resources. Thus, there are many possible ways that a group might utilize natural resources. The example presented in our text is to compare the layout of these 2 cities, Chongqing, China, and San Francisco, California. Both are built on peninsulas surrounded by water. Both exhibit rather hilly and rugged terrain. Yet look at the pattern of the roads. The roads in Chongqing generally follow the topography, while the San Francisco roads are laid out adhering to a grid pattern. San Francisco is also less densely settled, with a smaller population occupying a much larger area of land. A third school of thought focuses on people's perception of the environment as being highly influential. Environmental perception has been used especially in studying response and preparedness for natural hazards. Every place on the planet is vulnerable to a mix of environmental hazards, from floods to tornadoes to mudslides to earthquakes. How do societies perceive and prepare for these risks? The ways that societies prepare for certain hazards can either protect people or leave them more vulnerable, such that a hazard becomes a disaster. Let's look briefly at Japan and the 3-part disaster of March 11, 2011. You may recall that Japan was struck by a magnitude 9 earthquake. Since this earthquake occurred on the ocean floor, it also unleashed a tsunami, waves of water that poured across the land, causing massive destruction and killing almost 29,000 people. This was the second part of the disaster. And then the third part of the disaster was the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Due to the earthquake, the power plant lost electricity. They had backup generators, but the generators were located in the basement of the building. When the tsunami struck, the lower levels were flooded, again knocking out electrical power. And the plant lost the ability to control the nuclear reactions. Our textbook asks, would you classify this triple disaster as natural or human-made? Japan is located along a complex subduction zone at the intersection of the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Plate, and the Eurasian Plate. The people have a long cultural memory of seismic events, earthquakes, and tsunamis. It is also a highly developed and wealthy country with strict building standards and highly engineered structures, such as skyscrapers that have gyroscopes that withstand tectonic movement, and seawalls to prevent flooding. On the one hand, Japan is prepared for these tectonic hazards. Yet perhaps some of this technology led to a false sense of security. On hill slopes, it's possible to find these tsunami stones. Some of them are hundreds of years old. They mark the elevation where one would be safe from tsunami waters. When a tsunami comes, or if you live in a coastal area that's prone to earthquakes, the way to survive is to get to high ground. These stones warn people, do not build your home below this point. During the 2011 tsunami, many people did not run for high ground because they thought that the seawalls would protect them. They did not imagine that the 18-foot seawalls would be overtopped. When we think of earthquakes in the United States, we tend to think of California, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Earthquakes in Southern California occur along a different kind of boundary, a transform fault. But farther north, there is a section of the west coast of the United States, along Washington State and Oregon State and part of Northern California, that lies along a subduction zone. Subduction zones are potentially much more hazardous. These can release powerful earthquakes. And what's more, this coastal area can also produce a tsunami. The cities of Portland and Seattle are generally unprepared for a large magnitude earthquake followed by a tsunami. In recent memory, this place has not experienced such an event. However, there is geologic evidence of a traumatic event 300 years ago. And there is written record in Japan from the year 1700. Japan experienced a tsunami that came without an earthquake. The earthquake must have happened here along the west coast of the United States, and the tsunami traveled all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Japan. In the 1980s, geologists in the United States began collecting stories from people whose families had lived in this region for hundreds of years. They found Native American groups actually had stories and oral traditions that told of this earthquake and tsunami. They said you should keep a canoe tied to a tree, and if the earth shakes, run to your canoe. The canoe will rise with the waters, and if it's tied to a tree, you won't be washed away. How do humans perceive our relationship with the environment? We can distinguish between an organic view of nature and a mechanistic view of nature. Carolyn Merchant, a professor of environmental history, philosophy, and ethics, has written, "The ancient cultures of East and West and the native peoples of America saw the earth as alive, active, and responsive to human action. Greeks and Renaissance Europeans conceptualized the cosmos as a living organism with a body, soul, and spirit, and the earth as a nurturing mother with respiratory, circulatory, reproductive, and elimination systems. For the past 300 years, Western mechanistic science and capitalism have viewed the earth as dead and inert, manipulable from outside, and exploitable for profits. Finally, to think of humans as modifiers of the earth is to emphasize the human impact on nature. Humans have deforested vast areas, have moved plant and animal species across the oceans, created new species through domestication, and caused species to go extinct. We've spread radioactive elements across the planet with nuclear bomb tests, and we've generated enough plastic pollution that it could show up in layers of rock in millions of years. There are even a number of scientists who suggest that we have entered a new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, the age of human influence.